From Juneteenth to the sky. I'm meteorologist Alan Seals, retired from a career in meteorology on TV. But most meteorologists are not on TV and not all forecast weather. This survey, which is not a dissertation, it's not in super detail, but it is a survey of highlights of African Americans in meteorology, which is also known as atmospheric science, or you can just call it weather. And it takes us from the Emancipation Proclamation through Juneteenth, which is a mashup of the word June and 19th, which is when the federal government really enforced the Emancipation Proclamation, to the point where we are now. I'm looking not only at television, but also academia, government, weather services, and the armed forces. So again, a lot of this comes from word of mouth. It comes from online research at the Library of Congress, also at the National Archives. And this is not an exhaustive view. This is not a dissertation. It is simply the highlights of achievements of African Americans in meteorology. I guess every weather presentation has to start with a map. It's not a weather map, but it is a War Department map from the mid-1860s showing the southeastern United States and the Texas coast, which is historically significant. Texas was the last state in which the enslaved people were informed by federal decree on June 19th that they were no longer enslaved. Now, in Galveston at the time, there were no records of weather information. The Weather Service hadn't yet been born, but Houston, Texas did have some weather reports. There are some gaps. In the middle of June, if you look on the far right side, you can see the weather observer left Houston to head to Galveston. On June 19th, partial data shows a temperature in the mid-80s in the middle of the afternoon. Clouds were typical, cumulus clouds, puffy clouds. But in the remarks on the right side, you'll notice mock sun. That's what we call a sundog. That means it started with cirrus clouds. So a typical summer day in Houston and likely in Galveston, a little bit of rain fell. Notice also in the remarks for June 20th, more substantially, the remarks are not about the weather. They say Yankee troops in town. That is significant. And this is fascinating. As I started this research project, looking through old newspapers, I ran across dozens of articles about colored weather prophets or Negro weather prophets. And this was all from the 1880s into the 1920s, maybe even later. So it made me start to wonder, was this something? Was it expected that African Americans had greater knowledge of weather than non-African Americans? Could it have been related to the fact that many slaves literally had to work outdoors, and of course, weather played a big role in that. But also personally, it reminded me that my great-grandmother, who was born in 1892, would tell me stories of her father, who people would ask questions about the weather, going from basically the late 1800s. So I don't know, but this is certainly a good place for someone to launch another study. Now, online, you will find a lot of information about a man named William Hallett Green. Oftentimes, his name will have an E at the end. This is 1884, basically 20 years after the end of slavery. This young man was a graduate of the City College of New York. He graduated at a fairly young age, near the top of his class, and he entered the Army Signal Corps. Now, that was the predecessor to the Weather Bureau and the predecessor to the National Weather Service. And you'll note in this letter from the War Department, which was dated the following year, it clearly says he will proceed to Pensacola, Florida, and report for duty as assistant to Sergeant Michael McGuarran, the man in charge of the station. Now, you'll notice the dates don't match. And the reason they don't is because after Mr. Green got to Pensacola, it was beyond drama. Now, his office chief, Sergeant McGuarran, sent this letter to his superiors in Washington, D.C. And if you can't read it, it said, "Why is it that there's not a hotel or boarding house in this city kept by white people that a colored man will be allowed to enter, that you would foist one upon this office? If he were permitted to serve here, the service would become the butt of ridicule, and any white person connected with the office would be socially ostracized." Now, keep in mind, this is a sergeant sending a letter to his superiors where he goes on to say that no matter what this man's qualifications are, it's a reflection upon me and a discredit to the service. In fact, the sergeant went on to say that if be desired that he remain, then I must request to be relieved. Now, that's known as insubordination. It made the newspapers at the time, and for many months it was discussed. It went to the highest levels of the War Department, and Secretary Lincoln, Secretary of War, became involved. Now, that's not Abraham Lincoln. That is one of the sons of Abraham Lincoln. Now, he commanded that this man be allowed to continue in the position he was assigned to be, and eventually the sergeant was demoted. He was not court-martialed, but he was demoted, and William Hallett Green became the office chief. So he may have been the first chief of a Weather Bureau or Army Signal Corps office in Pensacola. Now move forward to 1889. Joe Ballard, on the left from the Charlotte Democrat, he was a prophet, a weather prophet. Now, being African American, that makes him a Negro weather prophet. He was also a blacksmith, and he was known locally as a philosopher. But he was also chairman of the Republican County Committee where he lived. Now, what's interesting about what was called Uncle Joe Ballard is that in the early 1900s, there were a series of postcards featuring his image circulating. And one of those postcards upset what apparently was a fellow Republican who lived in a northern state. That person wrote to the paper that it is not fair for a colored person to have more political power than a white person. So that was 1889 going into the early 1900s. 1899, I hope you've heard of George Washington Carver, Dr. George Washington Carver. He's known for all of his research with peanuts and potatoes. He was at Tuskegee University, but he was also a weather observer. Not necessarily a weather forecaster, but as you would expect for someone involved in agriculture, it makes a lot of sense to keep up with the weather. So he was what's known as a volunteer weather observer, submitting reports to the U.S. Weather Bureau. And that, again, just shows that many African Americans were involved with weather, whether it was formally or informally. Now, I am really interested in this story. 1901, The Freeman, an illustrated colored newspaper. And if you're not aware, all throughout our history, there have been black newspapers along with what are traditionally white newspapers. And this one was proud to announce that a colored Weather Bureau man was hired in Mobile, Alabama. And that's significant to me because I've been in Mobile for 25 years, and I did not know that. I did not know that there was a black person working in weather in Mobile, especially that far back. Now, I know that there have been some recently. In 1901, this would have been the weather office location in downtown Mobile. The gentleman's name was never listed in the paper. So this is our problem with history. We have a little headline, but we don't know who the person was. 1901. But fast forward to 1909. The Montgomery, Alabama Advertiser ran this article about a Negro weatherman at work in Mobile. This man was from Snow Hill, Alabama, which is between Evergreen and Montgomery, Alabama. Now, if you can read on the right side what the article says, it mentions that Elijah Hardy was first stationed at Pensacola, Florida, but removed when the observer at the city found him incompetent. And it has incompetent in quotes. And then it says the appointment of the Negro here has caused much talk, and it is very probable that he will be found incompetent also in Mobile. All of that leads me to believe that, once again, this person was not necessarily not qualified, but I think ethnicity, what we now call race, but ethnicity was a factor. On the left side, likely from one of the colored newspapers, it simply says that Mr. Hardy, he passed the test, he was worthy of the position. But on the right side, it says that he would probably be sent from the office. I don't know the outcome of that story, but that would have been the office in which he worked on North Royal Street in Mobile in 1909. 1911, this one's fascinating to me. What's fascinating, the Savannah City Directory, is the price, $7.50 over 100 years ago. You know that would be way more than that now. But beneath it, something that made me chuckle, it's basic communication. It says, to find a name, you must know how to spell it. I like that. And if you could have spelled Campfield, you would have found Lewis M. Campfield, and he was the Assistant Weather Bureau Observer in Savannah, Georgia. When you look at his profile listed in the Oxford African American Studies Center, it says that he was descended from two mulatto families. Now, it's important to know what mulatto is if you're not aware. Mulatto meant that one of your parents was white and one of your parents was black. And what's also significant here is that he descended from what is now Haiti. So that brought up a big issue for me, and that is when you call someone African American, is that what they would call themselves? So that makes it pretty tricky also when you use words like black or African American. But in 1914, the word was colored. And this is a document that was issued from the Weather Bureau, and it's a memo that was sent to the Department of Agriculture. It lists all the employees, the colored employees at that time. And in that list at the bottom, there were two assistant weather observers. The DO stands, it's an abbreviation for ditto. But Lewis M. Campfield, who we just talked about, Lewis Morault Campfield, and then another assistant weather observer, Oscar H. Hammonds. Both of them earned just over $1,000 per year. So you move forward to 1920, and what do we find? Monthly Weather Review. Now, that is a book with high reputation among meteorologists that's been issued, obviously, for over 100 years. And one of the entries for the month of September was from an O.H. Hammonds. That's Oscar H. Hammonds. So there's no way to have known that this gentleman was African American or colored without doing a little bit of research. And that research led to this 1934 article about Oscar H. Hammonds. It references Reno, Nevada having the only Negro weatherman so far as known. So 1934, but what's even more significant, first of all, on the right, that's his Oscar in the middle of the picture. That is not his weather office. Those are his church members. He was also an actor and they put on a play. But what's significant is the author of the article. You may have heard of this man, Langston Hughes. Not only a playwright and a poet and a writer, but he was a newspaper writer at some time. So there's a little more history how meteorology intertwines with the rest of American history. 1944, Tuskegee Weather Detachment. This was a big deal, and this was one that many of us are aware of, that the armed forces were segregated into the early 1940s. In the mid-1940s, the government finally desegregated the armed forces, and that was the window not only for black pilots, but also for black meteorologists. So within this group of men that you see there, Wallace Reid and Archie Williams, two names that carried a lot of weight at that time, and also beyond that time, further training other African Americans in meteorology, of course, along with briefing pilots, for example. Now, you may also recognize Archie Williams as an Olympian. Yes, he competed in the Olympics. So Tuskegee was a major pipeline for African Americans into the Air Force and into the Weather Bureau, which again became the National Weather Service. 1951, Alice L. Hill. This is another one of our hidden figures that was news to me. In the late 1940s, when black women or women were allowed to enlist in the Air Force, she was one of the first black women to enlist. She was likely the first black woman to become a weather observer. And in 1951, she had the rank of corporal. Now let's move forward to 1960. Dr. Charles E. Anderson. He is the first African American to earn a doctorate in atmospheric science from MIT. Well, he was the first anywhere, but he earned it from MIT. Atmospheric science is the exact same as meteorology. He served at Tuskegee, later becoming an Army Air Force weather officer, working for a while in private industry, becoming a director of the Office of Federal Coordination in Meteorology, and spent much of his career as a professor and then an associate dean at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. 2 years later, Diane White. She became what is believed to be the first black weathercaster, the first black person on TV to deliver the weather. Now, she didn't have a meteorology degree, but it was still significant that she was the first that we know of in 1962. And that, of course, relates a little more to my profession in meteorology. In 1964, Dr. Warren Washington became the second African American to earn a PhD in atmospheric sciences. He became the first African American president of the American Meteorological Society. He earned or was awarded the National Medal of Science. He is a distinguished scholar, and he is still active as a groundbreaking researcher and a mentor to many. So back to Alice Hill. In 1971, she was the chief weather observer and the first woman in the Air Force weather to attain senior master sergeant. Many achievements that many folks like myself did not know. Now, I did know of June Bacon Bursey. In 1972, she became the first black TV chief meteorologist, and she was on air in Buffalo, New York. She was also the first black TV meteorologist with a meteorology degree. She was the first woman and the first black person to earn the American Meteorological Society's TV seal. In the mid-1970s, when I was in high school contemplating a career in meteorology, there was a lot of effort by NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to recognize the value of bringing in minorities. That's what black people were called at the time. You look at that picture on the left, some of you can recognize folks who later became lead forecasters and meteorologists in charge. What I did not know in the mid-1970s is that there were at least 2 black men listed as being meteorologists in charge at Weather Service offices, Ben L. Scott and Robert E. Woodward, Jr. So in 1978, June Bacon Bursey put together this report for the American Meteorological Society showing statistics on black meteorologists in the federal government. And what really should stand out is what's highlighted in the red box. Out of 7,000 meteorologists in the country in 1970, or at least in the mid-1970s, only about 110 were African American. And that's basically 1.5%. And that number, that statistic, in some areas, it has not really changed. 1975 was the year that Jackson State University, an HBCU, historically black college and university, launched a meteorology program. The goal was to increase the numbers of African American meteorologists, and JSU succeeded. It's estimated that about 30% of African Americans who earned a bachelor's degree in meteorology went through Jackson State. One of the early faculty in the program was Dr. Lonzy Lewis. He received his doctorate in atmospheric science in 1980, I believe as the third African American to do so. For me, as a meteorology major in college in the 1980s, I finally learned of and met a couple other black meteorologists. And then in graduate school at Florida State, I met Dr. Tom Carney, who is likely the fourth African American to earn a PhD in meteorology. Through the 1980s, there were only a handful of black meteorology PhDs that I'm aware of. In 1986, the first African American woman to earn a PhD in the atmospheric sciences was Dr. Denise Stevenson Hawk. Again, if I've overlooked something, please include it in the comments because this is a work in progress. My friend and colleague Brian Busby, to the best of my knowledge, in 1988 became the first degreed African American male chief meteorologist on TV. This was at KMBC TV in Kansas City, where he still is chief today. In the middle 1990s, once internet became ubiquitous and folks started getting cell phones, we were able to communicate better. So I learned about Bill Como. He is listed in some locations as being the first African American meteorologist in charge for the National Weather Service. However, that might be for the modernized National Weather Service versus the previous incarnations. Paul Trotter was a meteorologist in charge in New Orleans. He was there during Hurricane Katrina. And Renee Fair was likely the first African American woman meteorologist in charge. That was in Little Rock, Arkansas. 1996 marked the beginning of the graduate program in meteorology at Howard University, an HBCU. Howard has made tremendous contributions in educating African Americans. From what I've been able to gather, 40 to 50% of the total number of African American PhDs to date in the atmospheric sciences went through Howard. In 1998, John Jones Jr. was named Deputy Director of the National Weather Service. That was the number 2 position in the Weather Service, the highest that a black person had and has achieved so far. In 1999, I got to Mobile, Alabama as the first African American TV chief meteorologist. And most of my career, every place I've worked, I was the first African American meteorologist on TV. And if that wasn't the case, for example, in Chicago, I would have been the first one with a degree in meteorology. And that's not patting myself on the back, it's just a statement of historical fact. 2018 was significant. I became the first African American president of the National Weather Association, and that was after 42 other presidents. In 2019, Dr. Everett Joseph was named director of NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, becoming the first African American in that position. In 2021, Felicia Bowser became the second African American woman to lead a Weather Service forecast office as meteorologist in charge. That was in Tallahassee. In 2022, Dr. Michael C. Morgan was appointed Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction, making him the highest-ranking African American meteorologist within NOAA. In 2023, Dr. Danae Carlis became director of the National Severe Storms Laboratory. He is the first African American lab director in NOAA's Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. Let's look at a few statistics as we wind this down. In 2019, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics put out this annual data. It showed that there were 236 doctorates awarded in meteorology or atmospheric sciences. And out of that number, it looks like 2 and possibly a few more were African American. So remember that 1.5% that we looked at just a moment ago. It's still pretty much in that same range where African Americans are a small percentage of the field of meteorology. Within the membership of the American Meteorological Society, which is over 10,000, their latest survey as of 2020 shows 2% African American or black. What about NOAA? Now, NOAA is more than the National Weather Service, but in NOAA's annual report in 2021, we see that the numbers or percentages of African Americans is still fairly low. For that year, there were 3.8% black male, 5.2% black female, both of those below the current labor force, but it still shows that the numbers are not as high as they could be. Air Force weather, I was able to get this information as of 2024. Now, Air Force weather, these are not all forecasters. These are people involved in some degree with weather. 349 black or African Americans, we're talking about 9%. But again, we don't know the role that all of those individuals play. Now, every year, the American Meteorological Society has an annual conference, and I want you to focus on this group picture from 2024. This picture is significant because there are anywhere between 10 and 12 African American PhD holders in meteorology, many of them getting their degree from Howard University. What is significant about that, if you take 10 to 12, it looks like the total number of PhDs awarded in meteorology to date is about 50. So you're looking at what could be 25% of all African Americans with a PhD in meteorology in that picture. Now, there are also chief meteorologists. There's National Weather Service meteorologists in charge. There are other folks in academia within NOAA. So we are slowly making progress. And as we move forward, as always, remember history. Do you remember Benjamin Banneker? Well, in my education of his works, he was listed as an astronomer, but in his almanac and his multiple almanacs, first starting in 1792, he had a daily weather forecast. Just something that's really interesting. Well, I hope you have found the information here to be enlightening and maybe even entertaining. What I really hope, though, is that someone else or other folks will take some of this information as a launching pad to go much further in depth into all the different sectors of meteorology. There's so much information out there that I couldn't include, in part because I don't know it, but also in part because a lot of it is not digitized, it's not available. So it's going to take a lot more digging to pull out more of the interesting facts about African Americans in meteorology. That word or phrase, African American, it has different definitions. And I mean no disrespect to folks who may have a background where their parents came from the Caribbean and consider themselves Caribbean American. And that's a whole nother topic, is how do you break down where people came from and how they got to the point that they are. Think back in history, and there was a time well before the civil rights movement that some African Americans did not want to associate with being African American. And that was literally for their own safety. I'm meteorologist Alan Seales. If you have any updates or suggestions, please put them in the notes down beneath the video.